Hey everybody, Catalyst here. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you all are doing well. This is part 2 of the ranking reworked maps video that I put out last week, where Gravity and myself have teamed up to go through all the maps in 2042 and give them a score out of 10, and giving some analysis on how successful some of these map reworks were. At the end of the video, we will compile all the scores and have a ranking for you, but before we get to that, we still have some more maps to get through, starting with Exposure. If you haven't seen part 1, you can click in the top right hand corner of your screen right now, or you can go to the link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy.
Exposure is one of the wildest and unique designs in Battlefield series history, and that alone earns it some kudos. This large map is set in the Canadian Rockies in the aftermath of a landslide which has exposed portions of the research facility. This creates a layout of insane verticality. The flags at the lowest level are by far the worst on the map: distant, exposed, and vulnerable. They should not have been included in the 64-player size, but are acceptable in 128. The middle level, with the flags of the research facility, offers some of the best infantry close-quarters combat in the game. The top flags are a bit of an oddity. They are poorly laid out, a likely result of the 2042 flag clustering idea before the map design philosophy was changed. On the 128 version, the 4 flags are split into 2 clusters vastly distant from each other. On the 64-player layout, the flags are in a completely different combination. Only a single flag remains at the top, 2 in the middle level and close proximity, and the 2 lowest level flags remain. While not terrible, this smaller version has so much empty space and verticality that it is too big for the player count, and finding enemies can be a chore. Overall, Exposure is a terrible design for jets, but an excellent one for helicopters of all forms, which can use the terrain to great effect. Only the plateau at the top is suitable for armor, though it is not uncommon to see a tank use the vehicle elevator or just fly off the mountaintop and survive. The gameplay of Exposure would not have worked on any other Battlefield title. Even if you could use ziplines in older games, parachutes would never have been able to be cut and redeployed. Sprint speed would be far lower, and the odds of getting stuck on the terrain would most likely be extremely high. It is a brilliant, albeit flawed design, and one of the few which excels in its 128-player form.
Well, I'm glad that you end up liking 128-player version of this map, because the breakthrough layout, it hurts me so bad, Gravity. It hurts me so bad to talk about, bro. It really does. It hurts, because the original Exposure breakthrough layout, for my money, was one of the best in the game. It had its fair share of issues, most of which may or may not have been due to the discovery of the Superhind, if you remember that. The current layout is a steep downgrade in pretty much every single way from the original experience. This map wasn't reworked, but the way that they redid the breakthrough, it might as well have been. Multiple sectors force you to play for the objectives are at the bottom of the landslide, which may not be so bad if the other objective in the sector wasn't at the top of the landslide. So if you're lucky enough to be able to push through the choke points in the upper objectives, your reward is trying to get down the mountain and take the bottom objectives under sniper fire and vehicle fire from the oppressive verticality. And if you happen to capture the bottom objective first, running up the hills under the same level of sniper and vehicle fire is just not appealing. Having the second objective of the second sector not be in the gigantic tunnel was a mistake for me. Sure, it may not have played the best, as it could have been a grind between the 2 vehicles in the tunnel, and it was a bit of a clusterfuck at times. I think it was much better than having to go up and down the mountain. Finally, similar to Kaleidoscope, the last sector being in the bunker instead of a single capture point on top of the mountain in the parking lot area, as it was previously, is an outlandish mistake, and it often results in attackers blowing full ticket amounts trying to do the impossible and push through one of 3 narrow entrances. This is not to mention that just the sheer verticality of the map makes Exposure one of the most rat-infested maps in the entire game. I seriously do not know how DICE was able to fuck this one up so badly, but alas, here is Exposure.
For the 64-player Conquest, 5 out of 10. For 128-player, 7 out of 10.
4 out of 10.
Orbital, the first map of 2042, chosen to be the alpha and the beta map. Almost certainly the singular standout in a game of mediocrity. In terms of its conquest layout, even before its rework, it was a solid design, now launched to new heights. Orbital is both an excellent infantry and vehicle map with plentiful amounts of cover and flags spaced at effective distances. It has landmarks unique not only to the game, but to the series, providing a feeling of something genuinely new. A vehicle assembly building with its vast, complex, and vertical interior encapsulating a rocket being assembled offers dynamic gameplay options capable of big flanks, tight infantry grinds, and wild battlefield moments. Atop the structure, a flag which provides some of the most intense fights as well, and once you find yourself victorious at the top, you simply jump, parachute, or glide down to any of the multiple nearby flags in range to continue the battle. On the opposite end of the crawlerway, the launch gantry holds a large rocket primed for launch, which it will during the battle, or explode in glorious fashion. This makes Orbital the only map in 2042 with a substantial event akin to the Levolutions of Battlefield 4. The gantry itself, with its flag placed right near the launch mount, is not the greatest objective. The biggest issue of the point remains poor spawn locations. Along the crawlerway, 2 more objectives are excellently spaced, have great cover, and feature a connecting tunnel making for great infantry meat grinders. A third capture point in the 64-player variant closes the flag gaps even more, and creates, quite simply, the best 64-player map in the game. In the 128-player version, the newly tightened map rework fills the giant empty hole in the center, between the lower launch prep zone and the cryoplant refinery. A new bunker objective sits high atop the mountain, acting as a chaotic beehive of activity, both in the area around the hillsides and in the massive vehicle tunnel which runs below. The hillsides leaving the main deployments, though primarily the one by the center bunker, balance out the map's 3 pillars of verticality. These hillsides are rarely too much of an issue, though they are exploitable by the railgun tank, which shouldn't be in the game to begin with, although suffering from a few areas with really bad spawn points. Overall, the gameplay on Orbital in both Conquest variants is dynamic, fast-paced, extremely enjoyable, and suitable for every specialist.
While Orbital is definitely one of the better layouts of the game, I found myself a little sour about it, and I can't quite exactly put my finger on why. I feel as though I should like it more than I actually do. Don't get me wrong, in a game piled with some pretty subpar layouts, Orbital is one that is actually quite good. The objectives are all well designed, if not a bit one-note aesthetically. The rocket gantry and the silo offer some truly unique battlefield gameplay. However, this is the one map in the game that I absolutely refuse to play on defense because the defensive spawns throughout the entire layout are abysmal. Whether they are spawning you down a mountain, outside the rocket gantry, in the open fields, down beneath the silo, these are some of the worst spawns in Conquest, and I also happen to be on most of these breakthrough objectives. The distance between the flags in a couple of sectors, mainly the 1st and 3rd sector, are just a tad bit too spread apart, and it often results in some annoying instances of rushing back and forth between, underneath, and across the airstrip that, in my opinion, not enough was done to that section of the map in the rework. The final sector is a bit of a sham for defenders, kind of similar to the last sector on Flashpoint, as it's very difficult to defend given the spawns mentioned earlier and the overall verticality of the point. You should want to trigger the Levolution because it's cool, not because it gives you a better chance of holding the point. So beyond that, Orbital is a solid breakthrough map, but maybe not to my personal taste.
Orbital Conquest? 8 out of 10.
6 out of 10.
Oh, it's barely anything like Savad.
Nothing like Zavid. Nothing like Zavid whatsoever.
Yes, a Season 5 map, Reclaimed, was teased as a reimagining of a classic Battlefield 4 location, something which wouldn't be one-to-one, and boy did they nail that description. Is Reclaimed bad? Well, not really, but it certainly doesn't have the magic of the map which inspired it. This six-flag design focuses all its energy to capture the feeling of the center warehouse fights on BF4's Zavad 311. Only 1. Both buildings feel slightly small in scale. 2. The building to the north feels like an empty shell with way too many openings, making it a death trap. 3. It barely maintains a ceiling of its own, which, 4. Prevents any connecting walkway between the building rooftops. 5. One of the most memorable features of Zavad was its underground tunnel system connecting both buildings, also completely missing here. And 6. The spawn points around the buildings are absolutely terrible. There is no 128-player version of Reclaimed, thank goodness, as it would be insane. Even with 64 players, the Conquest version can get a little wild at times. This isn't a bad thing. High-intensity Battlefield is often the best. The 4 other flags of the map, each set in a fairly close corner, are not bad. In fact, they are distinct and filled with cover, which I love. I can't fault the objectives for anything in Conquest, truthfully. Even the bunker flag, which is enjoyable here despite the misery in Breakthrough. The problem singularly lies on these objectives' close proximity to the deployment zones, which makes capturing your enemy's gimme flags almost pointless. Lastly, given its size, it is the first map released without certain vehicle categories like gunships or jets, and thank goodness for that. Reclaimed is a flawed, often frustrating, and slightly disappointing reimagining of a classic Battlefield design, but otherwise is an enjoyable map filled with high-intensity combat.
The experience you get on Reclaimed Breakthrough is a bit of a coin toss. There are times where it'll feel like one of the better maps in the rotation, given that intense infantry close combat that you talked about. And, other times it's frankly just an absolutely infuriating experience. And I know people will probably say, well, yeah, there are some rounds where you're going to be frustrated and some rounds where you're going to enjoy yourself on any map. But I feel like on Reclaimed, it's a bit more frequently flip-floppy. This is one of the only maps in the game that, if I recall correctly, that allows an air vehicle in Breakthrough other than the gunship to be used by the attacking side. So Nightbirds and stealth helicopters are in play, and that spices up the gameplay in a good way, in my opinion. With that said, there are times where I think that this map would be much better off being completely infantry focused, as cav brawlers and rams dominate in spaces that could contain quality close quarter combats otherwise. The second sector, which contains those warehouses, is probably the best out of the bunch, but once you take off those nostalgia goggles thinking, oh my gosh, this is like Zavad 311, this is amazing. The factory buildings are not as well designed as one would hope, and they're certainly not as well designed as they were in the original. The terrain and the cover of this sector really herds attackers into taking the storage facility first, which is the B2 objective, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I would prefer it if the terrain and cover in and around both factory buildings were equal, or at the very least, you kind of alluded to it, Gravity, you can include the underground section that is missing from this version of the map. This would do something that Battlefield 2042 does not do particularly well in Breakthrough, and that is entice attackers to attack multiple objectives at the same time instead of Zerg rushing from one to the other. That's something that Battlefield 5 did better. It's something that Battlefield 1 did better. 2042 struggles with that. It makes Breakthrough feel very Zerg rushy. Unfortunately, Reclaimed is yet another map in which DICE features a capture point inside a tight enclosed area with limited entrances. While most certainly the least egregious out of the 3 of its kind, this point is still just horrible for the entire map laid out. If you are not the biggest fan of how the map plays up until this sector, you are certainly not going to be won over by DICE's open invitation to bash your head against a wall until either break the wall or run out of tickets. So Reclaimed, summarized, is, in my opinion, missed potential, trying to capitalize off nostalgia that just doesn't quite land. It's decent enough, it's got its moments, but ultimately it's a bit of a hit or miss map.
Conquest, 6 out of 10.
5 out of 10. Oh, it's my turn to gush about a map. I haven't been able to be positive about a map yet.
Spearhead Breakthrough is, yeah, you nailed that. Spearhead Breakthrough is so good.
So good. Oh, it's so good. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Spearhead is about as simple as it gets. Basic objective designs, small rolling green hills intercut with smaller streams and rocky canyons, all the way from one side of the map to the other. Oh, and there's also those giant cubes, which are the prizes of the map. As far as a conquest design goes, Spearhead is a really good experience, but it's not a masterpiece. It features a picturesque landscape and a great color palette. The lighting is fantastic, and there is cover via the terrain in almost all the right places. Spawn points are usually okay and are mostly placed behind the rocks and canyons. An 8-flag mirrored layout, both conquest modes utilize the same design, and it suffers the same issues as some other 2042 maps. The 64-player size is slightly too big, and the 128-player size is not necessarily small, just funneled poorly. The very center of the map, with its cool C1 flag and the mega cube housing the C2 flag just south, are far and away the best locations to encounter enemies and have a good time. Another cube makes up the US gimme flag of E1, though it seems a bit odd in Conquest, as there is nothing of equivalent size or structure on the Russian side of the map. This tends to make the majority of players on either version ignore the A1 and A2 flags, both because of their simplicity, and being near the Russian deployment, again like other maps, make them difficult, if not disappointing flags to capture and hold, whereas a single squad can weather multiple counterattacks on the E1 cube. Walking and driving distances are fairly good on it as well, although there are definitely areas where it feels like something could have been added or the map border tightened. It is a map which works well for nearly all vehicles, ground and air, given the terrain and cube size, though railgun tours can still beam enemy aircraft across the entire map from the deployment zone. Aside from a few areas where enemies and assets are scarce, Spearhead is largely a great experience, and probably the second best conquest map in the game.
I mean, what can I really say? Spearhead is a great breakthrough map. The best breakthrough map in the game, and I don't think it's really close. Stranded is good, but I think Spearhead definitely takes the cake. The thing that Spearhead really does right that other maps tend to get really, really wrong, especially on sectors that have 2 flags, is the spacing between the objectives on the map. So whereas a lot of maps in the game, sometimes you can be spread way too thin, Spearhead does a great job of having capture areas that are the perfect distance apart, resulting in some of the best map flow in the entire game for breakthrough. The playable boundaries are just big enough to allow for the flexible vehicle gameplay to occur, but not overly large to where it affects the flow of the entire map. The battle in and around the gigantic cube facility in the 3rd sector is some of the best close quarters gunplay that 2042 can offer you. While it is hectic, it does not subject itself to the worst of Battlefield 2042 specialist ability and explosive spam, as there are multiple routes to get in and around the capture zones. Defensive spawns are usually given a decent amount of cover as well, or is hidden by terrain. The map itself is just really well done, and it's very aesthetically pleasing and unique. I don't really think there's anything else like this. There really isn't a sector that suffers from any real negative, and whereas other maps try to create artificial difficulty by placing impossible objectives in the last sector, kaleidoscope, reclaim exposure. The last sector of Spearhead is challenging, but not impossible. You can really feel the difficulty ramping up as you go throughout the map, and that's something that I know the developers try to capture every single time. And Spearhead does that well as well. You know, a lot of Spearhead games will go right down to the wire, so you're talking very satisfying, tight game, high kill games. Spearhead really does it all there. Yeah, it creates a lot of games that go down to the wire and serve as a good representation of a successful attempt of DICE's breakthrough design philosophy, and makes the map harder as it goes along. Spearhead is just a massive W, and, we happily play it.
Spearhead, a 7 out of 10.
9 out of 10. This fucking map. It's a map of all time, for sure.
Yeah. Manifest is a map that answers the question, what would happen if you made TDM no-shar canals, but for an entire Conquest layout? It is a maddening, container-filled environment littered with flanking opportunities and angles to be shot from. And the rework only doubled down on this philosophy. In a way, the container nightmare wouldn't be as big of a deal if it only took up a moderate chunk of the map, but it's practically continuous. Even on the cargo ships, which constitute the C and D flags, nothing but more containers are on board. This is slightly difficult to explain why this is such a bad thing, but here I go. If you have an area covered in map assets, you create a fast-paced, jumpy, on-edge atmosphere. It's why it works so well in a small TDM environment. But when you make players walk vast distances between flags in that same environment, your brain turns off for minor periods. You get distracted, burnt out, overwhelmed. You know that there could be enemies at every corner or above every crate, and even if there is, you just get tired and you don't care anymore. Your goal was simply to walk 45 seconds to a new flag, not to have an intense ambush every second along the way. And if you are being shot at or killed around every freaking corner or from some verticality advantage, you just get extremely frustrated. Maybe if it was all ground combat, just around corners, it would be okay. But it's not. Plentiful around the map are large cargo cranes, the largest being found on the docks, which give many players an absurd height advantage. Between Sundance and their wingsuit, and especially McKay with his grappling hook, all semblance of map restrictions, hiding places, or relative safety is completely broken. Worse still, these large dock cranes were among the most complained about element of the original design and were barely touched during the rework. Only 2 objectives on the entire layout had their flag locations moved, and even then, they barely affected map flow or the problems with vast distances between them. Manifest is a map emblematic of the cluster system, and the rework did it no favors. In addition, the rework added more cover in the form of defensive emplacements and fortifications, which might not seem bad, but it may have even been too much. It makes driving vehicles anywhere on the map frustrating since you always seem to get stuck on something. The rework did almost nothing to alleviate its major issues, and though the complex atop the main hill is an actively enjoyable experience when not being bombarded by helicopters, it nevertheless is the lone area with a different environment. It really doesn't matter which mode you play the map on. Manifest is annoying, frequently laggy, and mediocre at best.
Annoying, laggy, frame droppy. It's a dark map, so it's hard to see. No map flow. I cannot stand this map. Not a bit. If Hourglass did not exist, Manifest would be my least favorite map in the game by a wide margin. I think you said it perfectly. Manifest is the result of a smut, what if scenario, fantasy, where DICE said, what if we make no shark canals, but just the entire map? I'm not sure what DICE's end goal was with the rework, but doubling down on Container World would not have been the direction that I personally would have chosen. The deal-breaking problem with Manifest is a simple one. This map is simply oppressive in every single way. It's oppressive in the amount of angles and routes that you have to constantly check. It's oppressive in the verticality. It's exhausting to deal with. And you also have to take into account players being up on top of containers, which again adds on to the endless amount of angles to check as you try and make your way throughout the map. And one thing that we haven't talked too much about in this video is the way that these maps either encourage or discourage the use of certain specialists. We've talked about it a couple of times because ideally all of these maps, right, should have elements that can cater to every specialist in the game. It should cater to make the specialist feel all unique and viable. For Manifest, if you are not playing McKay, you're not playing Sundance, you are putting yourself at such a distinct disadvantage. To continue the oppressing gameplay of Manifest, the boats in the crane sector as well were largely untouched, as you mentioned. Smart teams will place insertion beacons up there and camp the zip lines, giving them constant map control over a pretty key cluster of objectives that are already a pain in the dick to take cleanly. And if you do not find yourself in the exhausting CQC blender, or you want to try your luck on a flank, that is where you'll find Manifest vehicles waiting to farm you, as they too are scared to go anywhere near the container clusterfuck. Manifest brings out the worst in Battlefield 2042's gameplay at every single turn. I would give this map a 0 out of 10 if I could, but you said that I couldn't, so...
Conquest, 5 out of 10.
3.5 out of 10.
So, after nearly an hour between two videos discussing all 12 of Battlefield 2042's maps, excluding the map that will be coming in Season 6 and any map that comes after that, here are the results. Hourglass got a 4 out of 10 in Conquest, a 3 out of 10 in Breakthrough, resulting in a 3.5 out of 10. Stranded got a 5 out of 10 on Conquest, an 8 out of 10 on Breakthrough, resulting in a 6.5 out of 10. Flashpoint got 6s in both Conquest and Breakthrough, resulting in a flat 6 out of 10. Renewal got a 6 out of 10 on Conquest, a 5 out of 10 on Breakthrough, resulting in a 5.5 out of 10. Discarded also got 6s in both Conquest and Breakthrough, resulting in a 6 out of 10. Breakaway got a 6 out of 10 on Conquest, a 5 out of 10 on Breakthrough, resulting in a 5.5 out of 10. Kaleidoscope got a 3 out of 10 for the 128 player layout of Conquest, a 4 out of 10 for the 64 player layout, and a 5 out of 10 in Breakthrough, resulting in a 4 out of 10. Exposure got a 7 out of 10 for its 128 player Conquest layout, a 5 out of 10 for the 64 player, and a 4 out of 10 for the Breakthrough, resulting in a 5.3 out of 10. Orbital got an 8 out of 10 for Conquest, and a 6 out of 10 for Breakthrough, resulting in a 7 out of 10. Reclaimed got a 6 out of 10 in Conquest, and a 5 out of 10 in Breakthrough, resulting in yet another 5.5 out of 10. Spearhead got a 7 out of 10 in Conquest, a 9 out of 10 in Breakthrough, resulting in an 8 out of 10. Manifest got a 5 out of 10 in Conquest, a 3.5 out of 10 in Breakthrough, resulting in a 4.2 out of 10, which means that in order from the best map in the game to the worst map in the game, Spearhead at an 8 out of 10, Orbital at a 7 out of 10, Stranded at a 6.5, Flashpoint at a 6, Discarded at a 6, Renewal at a 5.5, Reclaimed at a 5.5, and Breakaway at a 5.5 as well. Exposure at a 5.3, Manifest at a 4.2, Kaleidoscope at a 4, and the worst map still in the game, Hourglass, at a 3.5 out of 10. Thank you all so much for watching this series and for your support on these videos. Again, I do want to thank Gravity for taking part in this and helping me on this project, even though it took a lot longer than I think either of us really hoped that it would. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you drop a like on it and subscribe for more content. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is Catalyst, and I will see you all another time.